This is a conspiracy theory, and I generally try to avoid conspiracy theories, and it's admittedly speculative because I don't have any documentary evidence. But, my hunch is that zero tolerance policies in schools, where guns or depictions of guns or talk about guns or any kind of weapons or any kind of violence is strictly forbidden, and there's zero tolerance and harsh punishments, suspension, expulsion, etc. I think this is ultimately aimed at the Second Amendment. And here's why. Because these people have been attacking the Second Amendment for decades, and they haven't made much headway attacking it head on. They don't understand. They either don't understand or they're blatantly dishonest about statistics, about the law as it already is, about guns and how guns work, etc. And it's probably some combination of ignorance and dishonesty. But, this is obvious to anybody who has any acquaintance with the subject. And so these people get shut down and they get told off. And, we're just tired of their shit and we don't want to hear it. We have this national discussion that gets reopened every time there's an incident. Muslim guy shoots up 50 gays at a club in Orlando, and suddenly, instead of talking about Islam and terrorism, which is clearly the most obvious thing to talk about there, then we get this renewed national discussion about guns, or sometimes they try to shoe in homophobia or something unrelated. But it's a predictable song and dance. Every time there's some kind of incident, this national discussion or national dialogue about guns reopens. And that's really a euphemism, because discussion or dialogue to these people really means a one-sided harangue. And because they're clueless or dishonest, at least on this subject of guns, they always get shut down. And they get told off. And people don't want to hear it, and have been very clear that, we're not giving up the guns. And if you want them, come and get them, motherfuckers, basically. And so they're not making any headway there. But they have this trick up their sleeve, and that's the zero tolerance policies. They control the academic institutions, and they control the colleges of education, and they control the teachers and educators and their attitudes by that avenue. And so, if you think about it, once you have a generation or two generations of these kids who have been raised under these zero tolerance policies, where they're not allowed to even think about violence or about the tools of violence, how many of them are going to understand the Second Amendment? How many of them are going to be willing to defend it? And we know these people are shady. We know they're dishonest. We know they're crafty. We know they're devious. And we know that they're willing to play the long game. So, I think it seems reasonable to surmise that this is an example of long game that they're trying to play, and that ultimately the target is the Second Amendment, because the Second Amendment is a potent obstacle to their agendas, to their priorities, to their programs. They can only push so far and so fast, or they will provoke more backlash and more violent backlash than they can handle, than they want to deal with. And so they can implement their agendas, and they can impose more costs, and they can take more benefits if they can raise the cost of resistance. And the best way to raise the cost of resistance is to deprive people of the tools. And so the entire gun control agenda, from top to bottom, is pretty explicitly an attempt to disarm their political rivals in order to raise the cost of resistance to their political programs and their political agendas. So, I think it's pretty reasonable to surmise that this zero tolerance stuff in schools that's been going on for the last decade or two has something to do with that, and that they're trying to undermine, that respect for and understanding of the Second Amendment indirectly, by attacking people in a context where you can maybe justify the absence of weapons or violence a lot easier than you can outside of that context. And so they're really, it's a foot in the door, And I think they're trying to subtly undermine that and to pave the way for a full-on assault on that Second Amendment, on that right to keep and bear arms, because that ultimately is the people's veto. It is the people's vote of no confidence, and it always has been. And in any political order, the threat of violence is what restrains people from going too far. Like in any political order, when the cost of compliance becomes too high, then people will go back to violence and go back to conflict. And politics is really a substitute for violence and a substitute for conflict. Like, hey, it's cheaper to, maybe even lose an election than it is to fight a war about it. So, we're going to tolerate democracy, and we're even going to tolerate losing in a democracy because it's cheaper than going to war over it. And, one of the ways they can make people tolerate more abuse and more extraction and more imposition is by depriving them of the means to resist and the means to resort to violent conflict. And so if they can deprive them of the means, they can make violent conflict more costly, because they can make it harder and more difficult and more costly to resort to violence. And they can do that by depriving you of the means of engaging in violence. And so, I think that's ultimately what this is about. They want to accelerate their agenda. They want to accelerate their progressive programs and their progressive policies. And they want to extract more benefits, and they want to impose more costs. And the only way they can get people to tolerate that is to deprive them of the means of resistance, so that resistance is more costly and submission is, relatively less costly in comparison. And I think ultimately that's what this zero tolerance policy stuff is probably all about. They're trying to undermine this subtly, kind of a back route to undermining the Second Amendment, because they've had so little success challenging it head on.